the 30th of July, a train station has collapsed in Moscow. Holy shit, damn! The station is on fire! The tracks have been blown up. Muscovites are panicking. Railways are burning. A freight train is engulfed in flames. Hundreds of passengers have been evacuated. Traffic has been halted. We're leaving. Muscovites report. The roof collapsed after a powerful explosion. The tracks are burning. The station is engulfed in smoke. Look. That's it, basically. This is fucked. This is a total disaster. Trains have stopped all over the country. This is not just a blow to the capital. This is a significant and substantial blow to Russia's logistical capabilities and supply lines. Pirogovi, we are truly and utterly screwed in this situation, facing severe consequences. How exactly are they going to effectively remove it from the system? Airports are in chaos. Aeroflot is completely paralyzed. Their servers are destroyed, and all flights are cancelled. Meanwhile, Russia is restricting gasoline exports, and this is just the beginning. The economy is going into a tailspin. The country is frozen in flames. The 30th of July, Russia is caught in a transport and energy trap. We struck at the railways, railway junctions, and military equipment convoys. Passengers have been evacuated, a freight train is burning, and a logistics hub has been destroyed. Somewhere beyond the railway tracks, it's really burning. At the same time, Aeroflot is collapsing. Hackers have destroyed more than 7,000 servers. Hundreds of passengers are stranded in Moscow. Restoration will take up to 6 months, and the damage is estimated at $50 million. The Prosecutor General's office confirms the hacker attack was very successful. Those born to crawl will never fly. A drone is flying close by. And now, an oil shock as well. Russia is banning gasoline exports until the end of August. The reason is a shortage on the domestic market and disruptions at refineries after drone attacks and sanctions, according to Bloomberg. Here it is, the Severnaya power plant. We've arrived. Against this backdrop, an ultimatum from Trump: 10 days or else sanctions. We are entering a phase of economic destabilization. Strikes on the rails. The bridge has been blown up. The bridge has been blown up. Strikes in the sky. Here it is, the Severnaya power plant. We've arrived. Aviation and railway collapse. The train station is ablaze from a strike on the refinery. Military airfields are burning. I'll be there soon. There's a blaze. You can see all the smoke from the city. We discussed the consequences and the collapse of Russia with renowned economist Igor Lipsitz. Right now, let's start with the aviation collapse. All of this now costs $50 million. And it will take more than half a year to restore. Hackers simultaneously destroyed more than 7,000 servers. Hundreds of passengers are stranded in Moscow. How serious is this? Because Putin has already asked the new Minister of Transport to deal with the situation. What do you think? Well, it's quite amusing, especially when you start looking into the details of how it happened. It's really an outstanding illustration of how life in Russia is built on the word maybe. Maybe it'll work out, maybe no one will do anything, maybe no one will strike. And of course, it's a rather sad story that a country can formally exist in the 21st century, but still operate with outdated and inadequate methods for modern life. Failing to protect the national carrier from possible attacks is so foolish that it's astonishing this can actually happen in practice. But now they will try to restore things somehow. It's unclear how quickly they'll succeed. There's a lot of talk going around, but Of course, the very fact that this was possible means that despite all its loud claims about its outstanding programmers, Russia is not really prepared for new generation hybrid wars. This has always been discussed that hybrid wars are coming, where many battles and skirmishes will take place specifically in cyberspace, that various computing networks will be attacked, and that defenses are needed. But as you can see, Russia's largest airline, the national carrier, turned out to be completely and incompetently unprotected. It runs on Windows XP. Maybe young people don't even know what that is. I have no idea. In general, it's a nightmare of a story. This is about how Russia proudly claims to be an advanced country, but deep down, it's actually quite a rotten country with a lot of lost expertise. And many of the people who possess that expertise they've left the country. And of course, these are now very significant irrecoverable losses that will keep showing up here and there. Basically, we're about to see a whole series of such cases. In fact, look, Russia is now doomed to face two major problems.
The first is what you might call a return to old technologies, because it's impossible to create new things using new technologies.
The second is the loss of human capital. This process is ongoing and will only get worse because the education system is being destroyed. So, in this sense, you could say that Russia does have a future, but it's a dark, archaic, and rather poor one. That's what is clear today.
Igor Vladimirovich, we've actually been witnessing the aviation collapse for quite some time now because Russia, as a country at war, simply hasn't closed its airspace. That's why everything that's happening, well, Ukraine closed its airspace, so our airports aren't operating because missiles and drones are flying. And Russia, despite the fact that Ukraine is responding and launching missile and drone strikes, has not closed its airspace. In your opinion, is there any chance that Russia might close its airspace in the near future, or will Putin never go for that?
I don't think he ever will, because, to close the airspace would mean admitting that a minor regional peripheral military special operation has turned into a national war that is destroying everything. He can't go for that. For him, it would be a terrible defeat. So he'll try to reduce everything to isolated incidents and say, we'll fix this now, please be understanding, and so on and so forth. But that still won't save him. I always remember the story about Hitler. Hitler told the Germans the same story, both with his own words and through Goebbels, that the war was happening somewhere out east and had nothing to do with Germany, and that not a single bomb would ever fall on Berlin. After that, the British Air Force carried out a massive bombing of Berlin. Berlin was burning, and Berlin was terrified. And Hitler ended up looking like a liar in the eyes of his own people. It was a terrible, so to speak, a story of Hitler's defeat. He then changed his policy, and it led to even greater disaster for Germany. That's another story. But this is how a dictator tries with all his might to maintain the population's belief that there is no national war, that it's just some local regional operation, and it won't affect your life. Closing the airspace is an admission that the war has come to every home, and now you no longer live anywhere in a zone of peace. All of this is extremely unpleasant for Putin, which is why he's willing to sacrifice people's safety but keeps the skies open. In general, Russia is a vast territory with a huge number of industrial facilities, and these facilities cannot be protected there, simply aren't enough resources or systems to cover everything. And that is why, for the first time, as military experts note, Russia has found itself in a situation where its territory is not a factor of victory over the enemy, but rather a factor of weakness in the war.
Igor Vladimirovich, we've noticed that over the past month, Ukraine has been actively attacking railway hubs, energy facilities that power the railways, and train convoys in the Rostov region. From an economic standpoint, is Russia suffering losses? And of course, could this lead to a certain railway collapse similar to what is currently happening with the aviation collapse?
Well, as I understand it, the Ukrainian forces are trying in some way to disrupt stable life in Russia. Perhaps that's even possible. As you can see, we're witnessing a catastrophe in air transportation. The same goes for railway transportation. After all, Russia is simply too big a country to just shrug this off. As they say, you can't get around such a vast territory on foot, and you can't cover it all by car either. That's why, without railways and air transportation, the country starts to lose its connectivity. It begins to break up into isolated regions, each of which now essentially tries to survive on its own. This is, of course, a major problem, because don't think that railways are mainly about passenger transport. They are first and foremost about freight transportation. That's why logistics start to break down in situations like this, and then supply problems begin. So of course, this is a complex situation involving the breakdown of normal life, but perhaps this is necessary because Russia is still stubbornly trying to act as if there is no war. People write me letters. Why are you telling such scary stories? We're living as we always have, everything is fine for us, and you're telling us these frightening tales about the collapse of the economy for no reason. We don't feel any of that. You must be living in some other reality. In other words, they are trying to convince themselves that the war isn't about them, that the war doesn't concern them, that the war won't affect them. And for now, they personally are living well. Well, stories like attacks on airports, disasters with blocked railway connections, and apparently in the future, attacks on the Russian Federation's power systems. These are, in fact, a kind of system for, well, clearing people's minds. And then the population will start to get outraged, stop rejoicing over the war, and maybe, little by little, the mood of the Russian elite will begin to change. Because, well, nobody really wants the people to come after them with pitchforks.
Igor Vladimirovich. And then there's the oil shock. Russia is banning the export of gasoline until the end of August. The reason is a shortage on the domestic market and disruptions at refineries after drone attacks and sanctions, according to Bloomberg. What does this mean for Russia, first and foremost? Give us your economic assessment.
Well, look, the current situation is quite new and unprecedented. What's the point? In what sense? Look, the government has already imposed an export ban before, but it was for small oil companies, which aren't the main producers. They buy crude oil themselves, process it at their own refineries, and sell it at their own gas stations. This is kind of the second tier of the small oil business. But this time, for the first time, they've imposed a pretty substantial export ban on the major oil companies as well. And this means that now they can't make money from exports anymore. And Russian oil companies aren't exactly flush with profits. So now, in order to survive, they need to earn profits somewhere, and they're going to make those profits on the domestic market. So this whole story, where the government seems to be trying to, well, how should I put it, stop the rise in gasoline prices on the domestic market, I think the result will be exactly the opposite. Now, the oil companies will, as they say, be in free flight. Look, up until now, they were kind of kept on a short leash. If the price rises too much, we'll ban your export. Now, they've already banned it. There's nothing else they can ban you from. They can't punish you for raising prices and you don't have any money. But since you have nothing to lose, you start raising prices. That's why I think this situation will result in a significant increase in gasoline and diesel prices, which in turn will lead to higher transportation costs, increased prices for new goods, and will once again become a factor accelerating inflation. This is what we can now realistically expect.
Igor Vladimirovich, regarding the FSB and their work with tankers, the Russian FSB has begun issuing permits to foreign tankers to enter Black Sea ports. They are now inspecting all tankers. As a result, they have resumed the export of Kazakh oil, which had been blocked. However, it was blocked for quite some time. And this was due to the fact that the FSB is concerned about strikes on tankers, primarily on the shadow fleet. Putin is worried about this. Do you think this is a serious signal? Because we know that the GUR has carried out a number of special operations and has attacked the shadow fleet of the Russian Federation, and most likely this will continue. What do you think?
Well, look, as I said, Russia is now in a situation where its territory and industrial infrastructure have become not only the foundation of its strength, but also a source of trouble. You can't cover everything. You can't protect all the ports. You can't protect all the pipelines, all the power plants. Substations, you simply don't have that much air defense. And all of this poses a threat to the stable functioning of the economy. So that's why, of course, problems are now starting with Kazakh oil export. The situation is still completely unclear. Most likely, this will be a rather unpleasant situation for Kazakhstan, and it will probably have to ramp up larger scale deliveries through Azerbaijan. There is such a route where they transport oil across the Caspian to Azerbaijan, and then from Azerbaijan it is sent abroad. Previously, there was a convenient model through Novorossiysk, but overall, this second route was not particularly important. Now, I think Kazakhstan will be restructuring, and this will be a factor, how should I put it, in Kazakhstan drifting even further away from Russia. In other words, Russia is on a path where it keeps losing something all the time. Among other things, it is losing allies because the war makes it impossible to operate calmly through Russian territory, and transit, which used to be a peaceful ordinary civilian sphere, is now becoming a war zone, and the FSB is starting to control everything and everything. I now have a paranoid sense of danger. What if some tanker brought with it a number of various drones and they quietly flew out through the hatches and went to sink neighboring tankers. After the incident with those containers, everyone is now scared. No one knows where else containers might be located on Russian territory. A terrible paranoia has now set in. Everyone is trying to, there are now inspections on the roads of all these container trucks, which is also a blow to logistics. But the point is, now Kazakhstan, together with Azerbaijan, needs to build its own oil routes and logistics outside and independent of Russia. And accordingly, Kazakhstan will have no particular interest in maintaining a close friendship with Russia anymore. There just won't be that interest. They will now, well, increasingly go their own separate ways. In other words, Russia is losing its allies. The former Soviet republics, which used to be allies, are now starting to actively quarrel with Russia, and it is losing what used to be its sphere of influence.
Igor Vladimirovich, before we discuss Trump's sanctions against Russia and, of course, the new package of European Union sanctions in effect, I simply can't avoid talking with you about Putin's celebration of Russian Navy Day in St. Petersburg, which in fact took place without a parade. And I'm interested in your point of view. Why did Putin cancel the parade for the first time? Was it for security reasons, economic reasons, or because of the general state of the Russian fleet? How do you assess this action? And of course, on that day there was an unprecedented attack on the Leningrad region, on St. Petersburg. What do you think?
Well, I'm not a military expert, so it's hard for me to assess such things. I think that, of course, most likely it was an attempt not to lose face. And under the conditions of drone attacks, that's pretty easy to do, so it's impossible to cover everything. Drones can fly far, and it's quite difficult to cover the Leningrad region after all. It's large. So, of course, most likely there was a concern that some incidents might happen right during the parade. And that would be, generally speaking, a rather unpleasant situation, especially since, as they say, things aren't going very well with the Navy ships in Russia. The ships need to be protected, as you know, which is why they fled from Sevastopol. The whole story with Crimea was all about keeping the port of Sevastopol. Let's remember how it all started, right? There was this idea that the Ukrainian government would gradually push the Black Sea Fleet out of Sevastopol. Without Sevastopol, the Black Sea Fleet can't survive. So let's seize Crimea to guarantee the fleet's presence in Sevastopol. In the end, as you know, the fleet fled from Sevastopol and is now hiding somewhere in the Sea of Azov, apparently somewhere near Novorossiysk, as far as I understand. In other words, the front was extensive. I think they were trying to avoid this kind of front with the Baltic Fleet, especially since Russia can't really build new ships right now.
Igor Vladimirovich, now we're getting to the main topic, Trump's decision. He said that 50 days is too much. He's giving 10 to 12. But again, whether his words can be trusted is highly questionable. But as we understand it, most likely the Senate will have to vote, and it's possible that Trump himself will personally reimpose these 100% tariffs on countries that buy energy resources from Russia. This will affect India and China. Let's discuss this from a geopolitical and economic perspective. Do you think these sanctions will be imposed, and how might they change Russia's ability to wage war against Ukraine?
Well, for now, it seems that most likely these sanctions won't be imposed at all. That is, the document will be adopted, but as far as I understand, it will be in the version that allows the US president to impose such tariffs. Not to impose, but to allow the US president to do so. Again, everything will be at the president's discretion. Whether he will actually impose them is doubtful. Well, formally, of course, he can do it, and then India would have to reconsider its energy supply system and its oil imports. India has already stated, by the way, that it is ready to completely give up Russian oil and switch to Guyana. That's true. But whether this will actually be implemented, I don't really believe it. The thing is, you really can't look at the whole world. I understand that for the people of Ukraine, it's perfectly logical to view the world through the lens of the Russian-Ukrainian war, because in wartime, any other perspective is simply impossible. But the world doesn't work that way, and for the United States, the main adversary is still China. While India is, you could say, a natural ally against China, since India and China have extremely hostile relations, as you may know. That's why it isn't very rational to quarrel with a potential ally in any kind of conflict with China. That's why I don't really believe that such tariffs will be imposed against India or Turkey. Everything else is just a minor detail that doesn't really matter. If yes, this were to be implemented, it would be a major blow to Russia, because if India were to refuse Russian oil, the resulting drop in revenue from Russian oil exports would be about twofold. That would be a very serious blow. But I repeat, I don't really believe that such a measure will be applied to India.
Igor Vladimirovich, then what was Trump talking about when he mentioned 10 to 12 days? What actions was Trump referring to?
You know, Dasha, there's a new joke going around that Trump has been given new pills and now he's become very decisive. Well, what can I say? What can you do? It's funny, of course. You see, Trump is always generating some kind of jokes around himself. The only problem is he's joking about the president of the United States. That kind of ruins the quality of the joke. And so,
And, when I spoke with the former Ukrainian ambassador to the US, Trump actually has a nickname, Taco. Trump always backs down. Could that really work in this case too?
well, as far as we can tell, he makes a lot of tough threats, but he's very afraid to actually make a decision. That's why during his entire presidency, there were only a few real decisions that he actually carried out. For example, there was the attack on Iran, and now he signed some kind of agreement with Europe, but even that is not even really an agreement with Europe yet. It's more like a memorandum of intent to sign an agreement with the European Union. So it's still not fully negotiated, discussed, or signed yet. It's not very clear at this point. So will he actually go through with it? It's pretty hard to say. Generally, he's very afraid to do something that would be irreversible and that he wouldn't be able to fix. So as soon as the moment comes when a final decision needs to be made, he immediately backs down. That's exactly the story here. He doesn't know what to do about Russia. Well, Dasha, you have to understand that he has no idea what to do about Russia, and neither does the European Union. They don't know what to do about Russia. Should they destroy Russia or not? Should they aim for Putin's downfall and, so to speak, the collapse of the entire regime or not? That's where the whole problem comes from. Trump and the European Union, they impose sanctions and then lift them. Again, let's pay attention to the fact that they've introduced the 18th package. We were kind of glad that it was a rather tough package, and they introduced it on Friday, but by Monday they backtracked. And they postponed the introduction of sanctions on oil products for 6 months. This means they've repeated exactly the same foolish model as in 2022. For the first 6 months, oil products will be sold excellently to Turkey and oil will be sold to India. They will be able to supply oil products for 6 months before the sanctions take effect and make good money. In other words, the European Union has once again helped Putin earn more money to better finance the war. Well, the real picture isn't quite what people sometimes think, but that's how things are because neither the European Union nor the US knows what to do with Russia. They want to weaken it somehow, but not completely. They want to make it a little less dangerous, but still preserve its centralized power. That's the real problem. That's why there's no unified logic, no unified policy, no common goal, and no unified system of sanctions.
Igor Vladimirovich, is the reason why the EU and the US are doing this simply money profit business?
Not only that, no, not just that. There's another aspect to it. It lies in the fact that no one can predict what will happen if the centralized regime in Russia collapses. The West has a deep-seated fear that if the centralized Moscow regime falls, the country will begin to break apart, splitting into a number of small territorial entities that will be controlled by local criminal gangs. These gangs will trade in nuclear warheads and ballistic weapons, and Russian nuclear ballistic weapons will spread around the world, falling into the hands of terrorists. And these gangs themselves will be completely uncontrollable. It will be extremely difficult to maintain peace and global security. That's why there's always this feeling that it's better to have Putin than this collection of strange, unpredictable bandits controlling fragments of a collapsed Russia. And since they're genuinely afraid of this, they don't really want to destroy Putin's regime or destroy Russia, and they keep backing off. That's the problem.
Igor Vladimirovich, so someone fed them this story that if Putin leaves, Russia will fall apart and a nuclear war will start.
Yes, they believe in that. They absolutely don't care about Russia, about the people in Russia, or about Ukraine. Well, let me tell you a little story, all right? Will you give me some time?
Of course.
So there was this famous political scientist and political figure from the US, Zbigniew Brzezinski. I don't know if you've heard of him or not. He was an extremely well-known person who hated the Soviet Union very much because he was Polish, and like all Poles, he hated Russia very strongly. And he came to Moscow at quite an advanced age. I think it was in the early 90s, gave lectures at one of the universities, and was asked how the West views Russia. By then, it was already Russia as a country. And he drew a very simple diagram on the board. There was a river, two banks, as rivers always have. One bank was low with beautiful houses, and people standing by the houses, shading their eyes with their hands, looking across to the other side. The other bank was high, with a huge unfinished skyscraper on it, bricks falling from it, and a bear sitting on top of the skyscraper. And Brzezinski says, this is how we see you. We see you as a kind of dangerous skyscraper from which bricks are falling because of your bear. And our main concern is to make sure that these bricks don't fly across the river onto our houses, but fall on your own territory. This is exactly the story of how the West views Russia. Whatever happens in Russia, whatever happens in Ukraine, it doesn't matter as long as it doesn't fall on the houses of the French, the Portuguese, or the Dutch. Everything else isn't very important.
Igor Vladimirovich, so do they somehow equate an independent Ukraine with Russia?
For them, it's all the post-Soviet space. Well, whether you like it or not, everything east of Poland isn't really Europe. That's just how their mentality works. I understand that Ukrainians want to believe that Europe sees them as part of Europe, but that's not the case. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, they are not part of Europe. They're the Eastern Zone. It's always been that way. Everything east of the Czech Republic, east of Poland, is a different world. It's not quite the same. That's just how it really is. Apparently, this was once connected to religious divisions, but that's just how things turned out. And so they look at it as a sort of not quite Europe zone. It's too long a process, and I'm not even sure it's possible at all. There will always be some other idea. It's just the eastern part of the continent. We have nothing to do with it. Different people live there, and in general, they really are different from us. We have a complicated relationship with them, but to consider them part of our homino, we won't.
Igor Vladimirovich, what could change the situation? For example, could Putin attack NATO, considering that, well, if we remember Hitler's policy, the aggressor was appeased, and appeased. The Munich Agreement, and as a result, Hitler attacked Europe, and essentially the Second World War began. And could Putin simply, quite plainly, attack the Baltic countries, for example, in the near future? What do NATO's war games suggest?
Well, that's a question better addressed to military experts. As an economist, I can assume that Russia has already become significantly weakened over these years of war. After all, it was not prepared for such a prolonged war. It's the fourth year now, and soon the duration of the Russian-Ukrainian war will surpass that of the Great Patriotic War. And of course, Russia is starting to get jittery and nervous about it. Notice how nervously Lavrov suddenly spoke, saying that for the first time, we're fighting alone on the battlefield. We have no allies. After all, during the Great Patriotic War, we had help, and now we're alone on the battlefield against all our enemies. This is what you might call a hysterical outcry, really, because Russia has rarely achieved victory on its own. It achieved victories when it had allies. That was the case during the Great Patriotic War. Remember, it was the same in the war against Napoleon, right? That's when Russia succeeded Russian troops in combination with others, the Russian economy with support from abroad. They somehow managed to hold out. But on its own, Russia is unlikely to succeed. Especially since today Russia is very weakened with a smaller population, a severely damaged economy, and a heavily worn out infrastructure. A second front, I think, would simply be fatal for them. That's why I kind of hope that it will still be possible to keep this within the bounds of the current conflict. Another matter is that I don't believe the conflict with Ukraine, the war with Ukraine, can come to any real peaceful resolution. That's something I also
Igor Vladimirovich, many people are convinced that Russia's war against Ukraine will last a very long time, that Putin doesn't care at all about any sanctions, any threats. And as Kabeva said, he doesn't care about Trump's statements either. He's just trying to scare us. From an economic standpoint, do you think this war could go on for decades, say 5, 6, 7, 8, even 10 more years?
That's a good question. If it were up to Putin, and if he were the king of the economy, he might be able to think that way. But the thing is, when someone leads a large country, they start to feel too great, too important, and they become convinced that the country they govern simply cannot collapse. The thing is, I know all this firsthand, so to speak, because after all, I'm an old Soviet economist, and I know very well that this is exactly how the leadership of the USSR used to think. You may laugh, but in 1990, I made an attempt to save the USSR and prepared a memorandum on how the Soviet economy could be saved. At that time, the crisis situation was already very acute. In 1990, I wrote such a memorandum. It was sent to the Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, and because of that, nothing was done for the country. And a year later, the Soviet Union collapsed. Although I wrote there that the Soviet Union would collapse, the economy was unbalanced, and that the economy urgently needed to be stable. My colleague and I wrote a whole set of solutions. I have a lecture on YouTube. You can watch how I try to save the USSR. Such a bold title, but it's all true because I was afraid that the collapse of the USSR would be a great disaster. Unfortunately, I turned out to be right because I believed that the collapse of the USSR would never be peaceful and that there would be wars. As you can see, 30 years have passed since the collapse of the USSR, and wars are still ongoing. It started first in Central Asia, then there was the conflict between Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now it's the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and who knows? There was also Moldova. There was the war with Georgia. In other words, a continuous war, the collapse of the USSR was, for me, a fact after which war would begin. Of course, I did not want war, so I was ready to help save the USSR's economy, to prevent wars and human casualties. I wrote such a memo, but the USSR leadership believed that the Russian Soviet economy was so large, so strong, that it could not collapse. Putin thinks the same way, that Russia's economy is too big to collapse, but it is nowhere near as powerful as the Soviet Union's economy was. It has already been significantly depleted, and there are a great many crisis processes occurring within it. And I think that, of course, Putin will try to fight until his last drop of blood, until his last heartbeat. But the economy could fall apart right under his feet. I can't say exactly when this will happen, but it's already very clear that things are falling apart.
Igor Vladimirovich, in your opinion, do you think this war could go on for another 10 years?
It's really hard to say.
No illusions.
It's even hard to say. Well, it's hard to say, you know. The thing is, no one can ever say for sure when several events will come together. At some point, it's just a combination of events that occurs, you know, like when soldiers march across a bridge, and if they march in step, resonance occurs and the bridge collapses. There's a physical phenomenon like that. You should have learned about it in school. The phenomenon of resonance, it's the same thing in a country's economy. When several factors come together, well, look here. So why did the Soviet Union collapse, right? Because there was a very serious food problem. This really wore out and exhausted the population. There was no food, but people could still live. Russia and the Soviet Union lived for a long time with the largely unresolved problem of food supply. But then the drop in oil prices happened at the same time, right? And on top of that, there was also Gorbachev's desire to fight alcoholism. The anti-alcohol campaign began. And each of these individual factors alone could not have destroyed the USSR. But when all of this overlapped and it became clear that Moscow had no money to buy the loyalty of the regional bureaucracy, the regional bureaucracy suddenly wondered, why do we need Moscow? Why do we need the USSR? And this sudden feeling that maybe we would be better off without Moscow, without the USSR, led to the collapse of the USSR in just 3 days. Neither the huge Soviet army nor the massive KGB could save it. The same thing could potentially happen in Russia in the future. But exactly when that might happen, of course, I can't tell you.
Dear audience, please like this video. Igor Lipsis and I are working together on my YouTube channel, Daria Shaslivaya. The video will be on Igor Vladimirovich's YouTube channel. Subscribe to his channel, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Daria Shaslivaya. And in the comments, share your perspective on the situation and economy and write kind words in support of Ukraine and our partnership. Igor Vladimirovich Lipsis is a well-known economist. Igor Vladimirovich, thank you. I hope to see you again. Thank you very much.
All the best. Take care.